Hi everyone. It's been a long time since I've done lives. So, well, as per usual, my dogs will be in this video because they don't leave my side and children may interrupt, but I hopefully will get through the majority. So I'm going to continue the lives that I started a while ago. And Facebook had a whole bunch of issues with my lives. So if you happen to be on this live or later and notice that the video is messed up in some way, if you can leave a message below that says that so that I know to go back and look at it. I'll try to go back and review this today and make sure it's okay so that I can post it. So I am going through the book Radical Acceptance by Tara Brach, and on my business page, because my own page gets flooded, you can see the introduction and then chapter 1, which was from a while ago. And then I did 2 more chapters that got totally messed up. So now I'm going to redo and reread those chapters to give you kind of a review and update and thoughts. This really is a lovely book if you at all are interested in self-compassion. It's really a great book. So we're on chapter 2, and I would, if this were Jen's review, say that chapter 2 is kind of about awareness. That is the underlying theme that I think really shines through for me. And when we talk about awareness in radical acceptance, basically, you will hear this several times if you read that chapter, that she talks about that you have to accept yourself first and fully and wholly as you are, and then you can change. And there's some beautiful things about that. I talked about in the last video how I am a big believer of acceptance instead of expectations. So learning to accept instead of expect can change your life. And here's another great example of all of that. So in self-judgment and anxiety and sometimes depression, basically when I do the neuroscience part of it, which is my love and geekiness, is that your old triggers, right, for whatever experiences you had, your brain tries to protect you and runs kind of like, I've talked about this being the computer program, like it's an automatic program. And it forms neural pathways. And the more you're triggered in that same way, the more used those pathways are and the more automatic they become. And Tara says that these pathways are exactly what inhibits our freedom, our ability to move on. She tells a story about a tiger in a zoo, who was in a very confined space, and they end up creating a whole new exhibit and moving the tiger, and the tiger goes back into the corner and starts pacing in the same 12 by 12 grid that it did for years and years. Now, why would you do that when you had the freedom now to change, right? So it's a great example of how in our mind, whatever was triggering that tiger's old story, old neural pathways, whatever it was that the brain was trying to protect against, it goes back to that. So she goes on and she talks about the inner voices of not good enough again, and that you have to accept absolutely everything about ourselves and our lives. And when you do that, you become aware, and you become aware without controlling or judging your feelings. So you're not trying to avoid feelings, and you're not trying to punish yourself for those feelings, but you're recognizing them. And here's the key. and I talk about this with clients, is you have to recognize and not act on them, which sometimes we have to separate. So if you are not used to personal growth work, or you're just starting on your journey, for my coaching clients, I often stop at just awareness and I celebrate it. P.S. Like, all I do is win, win, win. I say that to my clients. I ask them for their wins. I celebrate their wins. Sometimes in talking to me, they don't even see or hear their wins, and I'll point out that they're wins, because that self-awareness is really a huge win. Because when you're stuck in what Tara would call the trance of unworthiness, you don't recognize it, right? Your inner voices are saying things to you, and you're reacting the way you have your whole life, and you're not really aware. So she goes on, I'm reading all my notes. You know how I love copious notes for all of you. Accepting this with an open and loving heart is really the key to this journey of radical acceptance. Because if we shut down or ignore things, we get swept into that whole, what she calls the trance of unworthiness. It's basically separating ourselves from reality, from the understanding of ourselves, and from others. And again, we ended last chapter with a great little activity. And by the way, we'll end this one also with an activity, a challenge for you. But the last challenge was to stop at different points of the day and say to yourself, it would be great if you did this in mirror work, but if you didn't, just say to yourself, do I accept myself fully in this moment? And to be aware of how you felt. So again, she was laying the groundwork for this awareness, because so many times during the day, we get into these patterns of berating ourselves, whether that's, I'm sick, I can't take care of myself, or I didn't take all of my supplements, or whatever it might be. Or we experience anger or fear or anxiety or jealousy, and our inner voice, instead of recognizing why we feel that way, accepting that we feel that way, we start with inner voices that kind of berate ourselves. So we say things like, I need to do this. I need more. I should have done this. I have to do this. Whatever that feeling is. And what happens is kind of this spiral, right? Into, do I really deserve this? I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. Something's going to go wrong because, right, something went right. And what you're telling yourself, and when people say that, they might not even realize what they're doing is saying out loud to themselves, I don't deserve this. I'm not worthy of whatever good thing is happening to me. And there could be guilt or shame that comes along with that. And this practice of radical acceptance is really trying to break that habit. It is powerful habit, and I will guarantee that every single person, and I've seen people very far into the path of radical acceptance, who still, we still have these little voices that say to us, oh geez, things, it's too good to be true kind of thing. Whereas really we should be looking at the things and doing all of the practices that we talked about in the previous chapter, which were savoring things, having gratitude for things the way they are, accepting things the way they are. And the really beautiful part of this is she talks about there are two major parts that are necessary for you on your journey to radical acceptance. And that is 1, mindfulness, and 2, compassion. What I love about that is if you hear me talk about anything that I'm passionate about, I include those two things. So when I talk about parenting, when I talk about your own personal journey towards your best self, those are two things that I talk about a lot. So she goes into and she says mindfulness, which, by the way, is just being aware without control, that you're willing to be in the presence of whatever is, and you basically are accepting that things are this as it is. You're not berating yourself. You're not saying if only. You're not judging whatever it is. You're just really becoming aware. Again, I would say it's becoming aware of the present situation. And as you practice mindfulness, this is what I tell my clients, the first step is that awareness, and you will suddenly start to be aware in different facets of your life. So that is like the power of mindfulness. Sometimes when we begin on this path, you're doing guided meditations, you're doing guided mindfulness because we're actually not used to that. We're not used to accepting things the way they are without judgment. And it allows that practice. And then once you start and continue that practice on a regular basis, you will be surprised at how that filters into your life. You'll start to see that mindfulness. And those are big wins, P.S., right? Because that's the beginning of this really powerful thing of radical acceptance. The second thing she says is compassion, which, she says, compassion is basically being able to relate in a tender and sympathetic way to what we perceive. It's not resisting or controlling or judging. All right. But basically, if you think of this in a parenting model, it is embracing our feelings, right? The situation that's happening with this gentleness, right? This openness, this caring. You're not judging it for right or wrong. And P.S., this is actually a huge thing I talk about in parenting because it's hard sometimes not to do that. But the really great moments are when you can approach another person and instead of judging them, give them compassion. Of course, there's a glitch. I apologize for that. I will also tell you that I talk about nonviolent communication all the time. Marshall Rosenberg, I think, should be lauded as one of the heroes. And he talks about compassion a lot. So if this goes well or people want more of this kind of chapter by chapter book thing, I might have to do nonviolent communication because I love it so much. But again, that is those two things. Mindfulness, which is really awareness, and then compassion, which is the absence of judgment. Really honor whatever experience you're having and are so important. This is where Tara says you can stop the cycle. You can become aware of exactly what your own triggers are, your own motivations are, your own coping mechanisms are, and it allows you to, she says, be softly present with open wounds, which I will tell you in my own personal journey is really hard to be present with that. But those balancing that, and also, allowing us to be softly present with open wounds, she considers as kind of like the checks and balances. So that would be how compassion balances mindfulness. And then mindfulness balances compassion because it allows us to see the pathways, whether, we have old stories that we get stuck in the cycle. And it allows that balance of don't be aware, right? Mindfulness is the awareness that now I'm starting on this pathway of that story. This always happens to me. This is because I'm so-and-so, or I'm so stupid, or I'm so impatient, or whatever it is that we tell ourselves since we're little. And it, again, these two things are why I celebrate those awareness wins, because I think that is the first step to really being able to change and shift. And she does say that later on, I think. I'll get there in my notes. She also says options become very clear when we can see the triggers, right? Because that allows us to move on and change things. You can't change things if you don't understand why they're happening. I talk about that a lot in parenting. So, right, like you judging a situation for what you think it is when you don't see clearly what happened upstream is pointless. Same thing goes for yourself. So it allows you space, I think, when you're talking about mindfulness, that awareness and compassion, to basically say what I can do when, right? It also allows you to look at what really are the consequences when I enact that behavior, right? Both for yourself and for others. And she relates this to Buddhism and the concept of clear comprehension. Basically, seeing everything without judgment allows us to align both our actions and what's true to our heart. So you will hear a lot of coaches talk about alignment when we do meditation, when you can feel good about things, that alignment is your heart and your actions are aligned and it feels good. When they're not in alignment, that's when you can become aware of what is happening inside. Because when it's not in alignment, that's usually where there's an issue. So I tell people to become aware of that. Sometimes they even say to track it. She doesn't talk about that, but I do. I talk about tracking those kinds of things because it is a way that our minds can kind of unconsciously become unaware if you don't track it, if you're, not paying attention to how often it's happening or what is happening when you're having those feelings. All right. I'm gonna move. Shh, quiet. Because I'm running out of power, which is always the thing. All right, so I'm gonna move over here. I'm gonna plug in and hopefully not lose you guys. So give me 1 second. Okay, so I'm plugged in now and I will not lose you for the end of this live. And my dogs, of course, are barking because I moved. All right. So I'm reorienting back to my notes. See the resisting, judging, grasping, and control of the pain and behaviors. We see that turning harshly on ourselves clouds what is actually happening, which I think, depending where you are on your personal journey, that little tidbit there can be very enlightening, because it may not be the situation. So oftentimes when I'm with clients, I talk about flipping it, changing your perspective. Tara doesn't talk about this. I don't know if she's going to talk about this in the future, but sometimes the awareness, right? We're aware that we feel a certain way, which is the first thing, but then we get stuck in the old wiring, in the old neurologic wiring, and we don't have the right perspective. Instead, we're berating ourselves, we're getting back into those old neural pathways, and we cannot see the forest through the trees, right? So she goes on and says, if you release the plans, you can see what is actually happening. And that is, the goal ultimately. She quotes a poet, Rumi, that says, "Don't turn away. Keep your gaze on the bandaged place, because that's where the light enters you," which is kind of a beautiful metaphor about not avoiding, right, the most painful places, because that's where we get to the heart of things for you. And she says you become tendered towards human vulnerability when you look at your own vulnerable place, bandaged place, right? Hurt place. And that times of great suffering can also become times of great spiritual insight. And I think in general, that is a concept that, mainstream is accepted, that you have to hit rock bottom kind of thing. That whole idea of in our worst moments, we can gain some amazing insight. And I will tell you from a personal perspective that if you have radical self-acceptance, that when you then reflect on the most painful times in your own life, it is easier to see them with that kind of inner sight of compassion, yes, but also the ability to change that. Like, what does that say about all of us? How do we, change? If you're stuck in that trance, you're not going to see it. So it's really important to see it. She then ends this kind of whole chapter with just reviewing misunderstandings, which, again, is funny because it very much parallels when I talk about some of the parenting philosophies that I use and that I really believe in. She talks about how the practice of radical acceptance is not the practice of self-indulgence. It does not excuse bad behavior, and it does not promote resignation. And I think that's really important, that the awareness piece means you're aware of it, that you're not judging it, but also that you're not acting on it. You're stopping that cycle of reacting. And I think that's where the miscommunication comes in. Like, that people think that I'm saying, excusing a bad behavior, which I am not. I'm not excusing it. And I'm also not saying that when you accept things the way they are, that you accept them and think that they should or will stay the same. And in fact, the opposite is kind of true. So she says, there's this misconception that we will accept ourselves and then lose the motivation to change. Now, every psychology and neurology thing that I read says the opposite. Okay, when you truly understand and accept where you are, it actually is the precipice of change, not the opposite. And I put a little note in here that I've told you guys that mindset is something that I kind of got obsessed with at one point because there were so many amazing studies on it. Carol Dweck wrote a book on it, and it is amazing. The idea of fixed mindset versus growth mindset, which basically means a fixed mindset says it is how it is and you can never change it, and that's just the way it is. So I will challenge you to say that is not what mindfulness is. That is not what radical self-acceptance is, or radical acceptance of the situation is not having the fixed mindset. Instead, it is seeing things clearly and not lying to yourself in good or bad, right? Not judging, and allowing you to practice a growth mindset, which says, okay, I accept things fully as they are now, and how do I want to change that? Like, what are the things that she's talking about in here to me really are moving towards a growth mindset. How do you change your fixed mindset? Well, it's, a fixed mindset says, I'm always clumsy. I'm always going to be clumsy. I'm never going to be graceful. That's just how it is. And a growth mindset is the exact opposite. And so there's some great old stories about that, like Michael Jordan kicked off his high school basketball team because he wasn't good enough, right? And he ends up being a superstar, and they told him that you're not good enough. And instead of a fixed mindset that says, yep, you're right, I'm not good enough, I'm never going to be good enough, I just won't play, was, no, I'm going to practice, I'm going to do this on my own, I'm going to come back, I'm going to be better, and I can do that. That's a growth mindset. And we want that in all aspects of our life, right? All right, sorry for my tangent. She goes on to say that is the fundamental shift to change, that acceptance doesn't allow us to create a new story or cycle back into the old story. Again, that's that neuroscience thing that I've talked about before. Oftentimes it's that neural pathway. We tell ourselves a story and we get stuck in that story because I'm clumsy, because I'm stupid, because nothing ever works out for me. Poor me, right? A lot of times those are the stories we hear over and over from other people or from ourselves. And when we really become aware without judgment, we don't allow ourselves to create a new story, which stops that cycle, which again, that's the precipice of change, right? Because we're not allowing ourselves to A, go into the old story, and B, not create a new story. Instead, we stop. We're aware, and that awareness is a great place to be. She goes on to say that this is not self-indulgence of motivation, behavior, or consequence. It leads to actually wiser choices because we open our eyes instead of avoidance or denying, which sometimes is the neural pathway. I know for me, I'm a big avoider of it, right? Like I just want to avoid whatever that pain is. So I've said to myself, I can't do it. And so then I just want to avoid it. I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to pursue it. I don't want to see it wholly. So we have to stop that. We have to face things, right? You have to face your demons. You've heard that a million times. Well, you also need to face them with the openness and the gentleness and the compassion so that you can see it just for what it is and allow that change to happen. She goes on and says, she ends with the definition of radical is really the root of a being, which actually is biology, the radical of a plant anyways. It's our original nature, basically. And really the idea of radical acceptance is to embrace wholly, not splinter, but look at things, find your true, authentic self. And this was a beautiful quote that meant something to her that I also found interesting. She ended up joining, she left an ashram and then found something else, and I don't remember what it was, but the teacher or leader in there said, the boundary to what we can accept is the boundary to our freedom. So good. She ends chapter 2 with the practice of being still and paying attention, Vipassana. And I will put a link in the comments. Now, I think her link is like something like 15 minutes, which if you find that too long, I would go back to maybe even YouTube it and put in Vipassana and see if you can get a short beginner Vipassana, something like that, if you feel like that's too daunting to you. And it is, she has the link that I'm going to put in there is the written out practice, and also she has on the bottom, you can press the audio so you can listen to her. She has a very slow, calm voice, and it's very funny. I often listen to her in increased speed because she's very slow. So I am also a big believer in do what feels right to you, because I want you to embrace these practices. So if it doesn't work for you, please find a different one. But it's a great little challenge, and I'm not asking you to do it every day like the last challenge. I am asking you to do it, all right, maybe 3 times. If you can do 3 times this week, Vipassana, just to get the idea of where we begin, right? That it is the beginning of awareness of the breath, allowing things to come, being aware of them, but not denying them, recognizing them, not acting on them. And I know that if any of you do mindfulness with Headspace or Calm, they talk about in any of the beginning meditations, the idea of mindfulness meditation is not about control, which was really hard for me because I want it to be controlled, right? And do exactly what they say I should do. But really it is about being aware. If thoughts come in, that they will also leave. And to be aware of them and recognizing them is important, because otherwise you get fixed on them and they won't leave. So I challenge you to do this. I don't know if she said how many times to do this, but I'm challenging you to do it 3 times until next week. And I will be back on Monday, 8 a.m. live. And I would love for you to have done this practice and join me in chapter 3 of Radical Acceptance. And until then, have a fantastic, beautiful fall week. It's gorgeous up here, and I'm so grateful for where I live, sending you all of those vibes of cool, crisp, beautiful change, to really be aware and savor all of those beautiful things. And if you have any comments, questions, things you want to discuss, please put them below. I will double check, and I'll put this also onto my business page so it can be seen either way. Have a great week, and I'll see you next week, guys.